Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philip Rees from ByteCube. Thank you for taking the time to participate in today's workshop. This is the 9th in a series of workshops delivered in this webinar format. Today's workshop topic focuses on commercialization readiness programs and beyond phase 2 considerations. Next slide, please. Today, our presenters and panelists will address commercialization readiness program eligibility, tools, offerings, best practices, and value. We'll start with an overview from the Cali group, followed by presentations from Army, DARPA, and TechLink, and we'll conclude with a Q&A session with the full panel. We have attempted to weave responses to questions we received in advance of the workshop into the presentations where possible. We will send an audio recording of this webinar within 2 days of the workshop's completion, as well as a transcript in approximately 30 business days. Next slide, please. Format. All participant microphones are muted for the duration of the webinar. Today's workshop is structured as follows: presentation, panel discussion, Q&A, summary, and wrap-up. At the end of this webinar, you'll be automatically redirected to a page where you'll be asked to provide some feedback regarding today's workshop. It should take you less than 5 minutes to complete the survey. We will also send the survey to the email you used to register. If you have questions during the presentation, please click on the blue question mark located at the top of the page. Please limit today's questions to the scope of this workshop's topics. Our presenters received questions in advance, and many of these will be addressed during their presentations. We find that many questions have been answered during earlier workshops or will be covered in future workshops, so we encourage you to review transcripts, recordings, and slides found on our website. The web address for prior webinars is contained on the last slide of this presentation. Next slide, please. Our objective today is to share tools and best practices that should guide your commercialization strategy. Next slide. Again, my name is Philip Rees from ByteCube, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our presenters and panelists are Janza Shumskis from the Cali group, Glenn Weaver from Army, Ann Newman from DARPA, and Ray Friesenheim from TechLink. To begin, I'd like to introduce Janza Shumskis from the Cali group. Janza, please unmute your microphone and take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Phil. I guess before I start, I'd like to say a quote from Bruce Lee. He once said, "The doubter said, man cannot fly. The doer said, maybe, but we'll try. And finally soared in the morning glow while non-believers watched from below." And I like that quote because I think it perfectly captures the participants in the DoD, SBR, and STTR programs, as well as the participants on this call. You guys are doers. You don't listen to the doubters, and your participation demonstrates that each of you is committed to creating a better world for the warfighter and this country. So I just want to really say thank you to all of you. So first, I'm going to introduce everyone to the commercialization readiness programs. Transitioning technologies from defense research organizations and technology development programs, such as the SBR and STTR programs, to military users has been a long-standing challenge for DoD. And so to address these challenges, Congress and DoD has established several program provisions and mechanisms over the past decade, including the establishment of the Commercialization Pilot Program, subsequently renamed the Commercialization Readiness Program, to accelerate the transition of SBIR and STTR funded technologies to phase 3, especially those that lead to acquisition programs and high priority military requirements such as fielded systems. As part of the program, Congress authorized the military departments to use up to 1% of SBIR funding to administer the program. This funding is used to provide assistance to SBIR awardees, including efforts to enhance networking and build relationships among small businesses, prime contractors, and DoD science and technology and acquisition communities. Each military department's SBIR program, so that's Army, Air Force, Navy, also has a network of transition facilitators who manage the CRP and other SBIR activities that support technology transition. These facilitators are located at military laboratories, acquisition centers, and PEO offices and work directly with government stakeholders to help ensure projects are responsive to warfighter needs. Although the roles and responsibilities vary somewhat across the military departments, in general, transition facilitators foster ties among small businesses, military research laboratories, and the acquisition community in support of transition opportunities. They also monitor project progress, including outcomes. Additionally, the military departments conduct conferences and workshops to provide opportunities for SBIR companies to interact with users and showcase their projects. Also, there are a few DoD SBIR components that offer special awards that supplement or extend Phase 2 projects. These are, in the Navy, it's called Phase 2B. In the Air Force, it's Phase 2 Enhancements. There are others. So the military departments and agencies, they've each developed individual mechanisms to do this. And you can get further information on those programs in the respective SBIR and STTR component websites. Finally, in 2011, DoD established the Rapid Innovation Program, or RIF. I'm sorry, it's actually now the Rapid Innovation Fund, to accelerate the fielding of technologies developed through SBIR, as well as defense laboratories and other innovative technologies. And RIF is funded at about 175 to 225 million each year. So it looks like the slides have already advanced, so you can stay here. So CRP used to be known as the Commercialization Pilot Program. It was authorized as something like a permanent program, as a readiness program in 2012 as a part of the reauthorization in 2012, and it's since been reauthorized through 2022. The purpose of CRP is to accelerate the transition of SBIR and STTR funded technologies to Phase 3, especially those that lead to programs of record and fielded systems. So this can be done through activities that enhance the connectivity among SBIR and STTR firms, prime contractors, the DoD science and technology and acquisition community. It can also be accomplished by improving an SBIR STTR firm's capability to provide the identified technology to the department directly or as a subcontractor. CRP is mandatory for the three services, Army, Air Force, and Navy, but some agencies, such as the Missile Defense Agency and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, they also offer commercialization assistance, and their programs are often referred to as transition assistance programs. Navy also has a transition assistance program called STP, and that's in addition to their CRP program. So again, how these assistant programs are implemented or offered varies by both service and component. And to find out more, it's best to visit the component-specific SBIR website and review the BAA instructions, which often provide information on these programs. But before I turn it over to Glenn to talk about the Army CRP program, I'd like to quickly go over what commercialization is. So next slide. So what is Phase 3 commercialization? In terms of the SBIR and STTR legislation, Phase 3 simply means further commercialization of an SBIR STTR funded product or service without the use of SBIR STTR funding. Simply put, it's the unfunded phase into which projects are expected to move after completing Phase 2. Phase 3 can technically happen after Phase 1, although it's very rare. So again, it's just the non-SBIR and STTR funding that's applied for work that extends or logically derives from the SBIR STTR work. So at non-procurement agencies such as NIH and NSF, Phase 3 is typically taken to mean the commercial take-up of SBIR-funded technologies. So what I mean by that, it means that the commercial market industry is ingesting those SBIR-funded technologies. But at DoD, the ultimate goal of Phase 3 or commercialization is what's referred to as transition of the SBIR STTR-funded technology to use within a DoD program, with recognition that use in a commercial market can serve to reduce price and improve availability. So that's the biggest differentiator at DoD. And you can go to the next slide, sorry. So more specifically, Phase 3 DoD means that a further contract exists from DoD or a DoD supplier, which is certified as a Phase 3 contract by the contracting officer. So essentially, it's certified as following on from an SBIR STTR award. So that's another differentiator at DoD. So at other federal agencies, Phase 3 just means commercialization. You've gotten non-SBIR STTR funding or you've sold the product on the commercial market. At DoD, that definition holds true, but it also means that you may have gotten a Phase 3 contract. And those Phase 3 contracts must be funded with non-SBR STTR funds in order to constitute a Phase 3. A Phase 3 contract looks a lot like a normal agency procurement because it's funded with mission funds or program funds that are non-SBR STTR. So when we talk about a Phase 3 contract, as opposed to the definition of what a Phase 3 is, we are talking about a federal contract or prime subcontract in parallel with or after the SBIR Phase 2 contract that is funded with non-SBR STTR funds for work that, again, logically extends or derives from the SBR STTR work. For small businesses, the most important factor regarding a Phase 3 contract is that it extends your data rights. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Glenn to discuss commercialization at Army.
Hello, everybody. Again, I'm Glenn Weaver, and I'm here with the Army SBIR program. First, as a way of introducing myself, is I work for a company that has the prime support contract with the Army SBIR program to effectively manage the program. And my role within this is to lead their technical assistance program, which I'll talk about later. My background, I have many years of experience in technology development and equipment manufacturing. It includes working within a government or one of the Army laboratories. I worked for several small companies that were involved with research and development and manufacturing of military equipment. And then in my most recent past, for about the last 15 years, I've worked as a consultant and have advised different Army program managers, managers within the Army labs, and small businesses in doing development within the Department of Defense, and in my case, almost exclusively within the Army. So what I'm going to talk about today are two things. One, I'm going to explain to you how the Army implements the Commercial Readiness Program, or CRP. And then I'm going to talk to you about the types of programs that the Army is looking for to move into the CRP. Next slide. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch terms on you. And I'm going to go from using the word Commercial Readiness Program, or CRP, into Phase 2 enhancements, because that is the technique that the Army uses to implement the CRP. So what you're looking at here on slide 11 is a page from our public website. Particularly if you're in the Army market, this would be a good place to start. It provides a pretty good background and and an overview of what the Phase 2 enhancement program is. I'm going to try to take it up a little bit higher for you and explain it to the broader market. So in our Phase 2 enhancement programs, what the Army is looking for are SBIR efforts that look promising and will benefit both the company and the Army from some additional R&D, some prototyping, testing, demonstration, or basically anything else that will help this program to make a transition into an Army program. So the Phase 2 enhancement is set up so that the Army SBIR program will add an additional $500,000 of funding, which is enough for another year of R&D, with the objective that we can bridge that gap between being a successful Phase 2 prototype program and getting into some type of an Army program. Next slide, please. So what this slide kind of lays out a cycle of how the SBIR program works. And I'm ultimately want to focus in on the top right, which is the transition area. But you can see, just to remind everybody of how the SBIR program works, is that the DoD organizations and elements have a set of requirements that they put together based on their whole body of knowledge, lessons learned, their R&D plans and all of that, to issue a set of topics. The companies bid or put in proposals against the topics. They are selected, awarded to phase one. Some of the companies move from phase one to phase two, and ultimately with the goal of everybody is to move into the phase three or commercialization. So within the Army program, I think this is pretty standard across most of the services, the phase one program is for $100,000 and nominally 6 months. At that point, you put in a proposal. If you're selected for a phase two award, then we fund an additional $50,000 with what is the phase one option, which is again a bridge to get you in between the end of phase one and phase two. And then we go into phase two, which is $1 million in roughly, nominally 2 years worth of effort. So that's the baseline program. Now, where the phase two enhancement program comes in is at some point during the phase two program, and this typically happens right about the 1 year mark or maybe with 6 months to go, the Army organizations and the contracting officer representatives and the technical POCs, start to identify what programs and the phase two efforts have been successful, and they're interested in moving into one of their programs. So then all this works, this starts to happen, and the phase two enhancements, we start to put that together and we position. And ultimately, so the phase two enhancement is, again, I'll just repeat, is $500,000 in an additional year of work in order to continue the R&D. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So we implement a phase two enhancement by modifying the phase two contract. It's really a pretty simple process, and can happen in some cases in a matter of weeks. We do that by putting additional scope, additional time, and additional funding onto the contract. And since it's a contracting action, you have to remember that the contracting officer rules at this point. The technical staff, of course, has a lot of input and everything else. But the key point here I want to make is that the Army is looking for these SBIR technologies that are going to support Army programs. That's the purpose of our phase two enhancement program, is to support our programs. So we're expecting also that the transition path is defined and that we have transition partners are on board. And these transition partners, they might be one of the government R&D labs, the Army R&D labs, it might be one of the program managers, or in many cases, the real transition partner is a prime contractor. So a typical phase two enhancement award. One would be a successful phase two contract leads into prototyping and test. For example, if it's hardware, this might be a breadboard or component level test. It's successful, looks like it's working, it does what the topic was intended to do. And so the next step would be to take this and put this into a system level type test in a real world environment. A recent example we had was one of our companies had developed an integrated circuit. Went through, the prototype was very successful. The Army was very interested in moving forward with it and putting it into one of their new sensor programs. So the small company partnered with one of the sensor manufacturers who acted as their transition partner to integrate and test what was essentially will be a near final design. So that's an example of the one type of contract that goes into a phase 2 enhancement. A second type of the typical phase 2 enhancement program is that we reach the end of phase 2. It's been successful, but we need some, I'll just say, tweaking, and for a number of reasons. Maybe we've changed the requirements. Maybe the requirements have shifted since the topics were first developed 3 years ago. Maybe the environment is a little bit different, or the mission is a little bit different, or something like that. Other reasons we might need some tweaking is it looks successful, but we need to reduce the size, weight, and power envelopes, or we need to get a better user interface, or things like that. So that's a typical type of program that the Army accepts to take into this phase 2 enhancement program. There are indeed others, and it doesn't need to be. There's no set prescribed definition of what a phase 2 enhancement was. I'll just give you sort of an idea to take the conversation. So we can move on to the next slide. So one of the features of the Army's Commercialization and Readiness program is also our Technical Assistance program. And so, as I told you earlier, I manage this aspect of the program for the Army, and the Technical Assistance program consists of a network of technical liaisons. These are scientists and engineers, and they are spread across our Army R&D markets, and we bring a wide range into both the market areas and the technologies that go into it. And so simply put, the job of our technical assistance advocates, as we call them, is to help our SBIR companies move forward from R&D and into sales. As an overview, there are 10 of us. We cover most of the Army market areas. Basically, if it flies or drives, if it shoots or stops, or if it communicates with or jams something, we have a person covering that market. And again, our job is to help you make that transition from R&D into those Army markets. This technical assistance is provided free of charge to all Army SBIR contract awardees, both phase 1 and phase 2, and it extends into phase 2 enhancements. There is an exception to that, is that the companies, when you put in your proposals, companies do have an option to obtain their own, what is called discretionary technical assistance, or DTA, which is described in the solicitation, and you can get additional funding to provide your own DTA instead of getting the government-provided support. Next slide. So we'll start to wrap this up and show you that some of the things our technical assistance advocates do, and you can see the list here. So one of the things we're especially looking to do is, hold on a second. I've lost the slide, guys. Oh, there it is, thanks. So, our number one job is to help the companies with their technology transition and commercialization. We spend a lot of time with the phase 2 enhancement programs. I would say probably 25 to 30% of our time is spent with companies that we've identified that we're going to move forward. We can help you solve your technical problems. Again, we're very kind of limited in our expertise as to how deep we can dig into that. But if you have a technology, what we do is we can provide you with the experience with maybe how the Army runs its test and evaluation process, or how the requirements process works, or how the acquisition cycles go. So that's where we can help you out on that. And I think one of the biggest things that we do is on that final bullet there is help you get connected in with the Army programs. a lot of people come in, a lot of companies come into this with no real close relationship to the organizations that put out the topic, and we try to do our best not to help build those relationships, but also I think where we seem to add a lot of value is because we have TAAs spread all over throughout the entire market area and all the R&D labs, because a lot of these technologies cross market areas, then we can help you connect those dots as well. So last slide, next. Actually, it's not the last one, but this is just to show you where our TAAs are located. I'll just take you around the map. So starting up at the top, Tank and Automotive Group is in Warren, Michigan. Soldier Systems in Natick, Massachusetts. Armaments at Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, we have the several areas. We have the chemical biological defense. We have the communication electronics in the C4ISR world, and we also have the Army Test and Evaluation Command. So those are three primary market areas in Aberdeen Proving Ground. At Delphi, Maryland is the headquarters for the Army Research Lab, ARL, which covers all of these market areas. Fort Detrick is our armed and military medical systems, and down finally at Redstone Arsenal is missiles and space and aviation. So those are the big market areas, and you can see this is our current suite of TAAs. So now the last slide going on is here's my contact information, also the general program information. Please, you can feel free to reach out to me at any time. I don't mind at all. I will say if you have a general question about how the SBIR program works, when solicitations are coming out, you're better directed going right into the help desk because they have all those answers. With that said, that's the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your time.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Let's continue and delve into some of the specific information about the DARPA's Transition to Commercialization Support Program with Ann Newman. Ann, unmute yourself, and please we'll bring your slides up.
Great, thank you. So go ahead to my first slide there. Oh, that's my robot. There we go. So I am Ann Newman with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and I support the small business office for the SBIR and STTR programs, and part of that program does include our transition and commercialization support program. So as mentioned before, the Army, Navy, Air Force, they are providing this service as a requirement, and we voluntarily offer the program, but we do it in our own sort of DARPA way. The goal of the program is to help out the small business maximize their potential. We want to get that technology into the hands of somebody other than the small business. Now, as was mentioned before, commercialization for DoD also includes quite a bit of work with other DoD efforts. DARPA does not have any tanks or ships or troops or anything like that, so we are not an end user. So we consider it to be a commercialization success if it goes on to support even another DARPA program not using SBIR funding that's eventually going to end up in the hands of a warfighter somewhere, or transitioning to a Navy program or an Air Force program so that it can eventually become useful technology for DoD, as well as all the commercialization aspects that you'll get from leaving the government. About our program, there's no cost to participate. It is covered by our overall SBIR budget here, and the team that we have is a support contract. They have been providing this support for quite some time, and they have a lot of expertise in these individual areas on how to help small businesses make these connections. All of our participants are given some information on this program once they are awarded a Phase 1 contract, and then they are automatically enrolled into the program upon Phase 2 award unless they're using the discretionary technical assistance or DTA funding that is an option for the DoD proposals to include. You can also opt out if you really just don't want to participate, but we find that the vast majority of our companies are very interested in participating and do get quite a benefit out of it. It starts off with an initial 1-hour kickoff call to help tailor the needs. Where is your company right now? What do they need from this program, and how can we help get you to your next source of funding? What can we do to help make those connections for you? Next slide. So a little bit more about that. The transition team here at the center of this graphic, they are going to be the ones that are making all of our connections for the small businesses. They're going to work with these small businesses to help them find their end user, or at least their next user. They are in communication constantly with most of the DARPA program managers, so they know what portfolios are happening within DARPA and can help set up those meetings and make those connections there. But they also have quite a few connections with the large primes, as well as other labs and other defense agencies and other government agencies, to help see where those needs might align with our small business projects. They also, instead of not just providing these assistances with making connections and networking, but they also provide business planning advice and help find opportunities outside of maybe the main line of thinking. Next slide. So this slide here shows a little bit of the support that is offered by our transition team. I'm not just going to read it off, but some of the highlights here are they will help put together some their deliverables on our contracts, actually, which are going to be the quad charts and the summary reports that are going to help when you have those conversations with your next customer. They're going to help you present your information in a way that they can digest it, whether they're DoD or the commercial world. And the transition team will help you perfect that, almost like that elevator speech, as they say, to help you get your point across as efficiently as you can. We also have a large alumni list to help target technology requests. So we can send out email blasts periodically that go to various different technology areas saying, hey, there's this new opportunity that's come up. Make sure that you're paying attention to it because it really closely aligns with what your project was. And then they also do quite a bit of outreach in terms of events, but also specifically going to these organizations, whether they're prime contractors or they're other government agencies, and meeting with the principal investigators there and meeting with the folks that are going to be looking for that next piece of technology to help them with their larger platform. And that's how they can help make those connections for the small businesses and help facilitate those meetings. Next slide. So in addition to those, the conferences and outreach that we do are quite a few events throughout the year where the team will attend and help make additional connections for the overall program to help find additional primes and government agencies, but also to host events at these outreach events where they can invite our small businesses to come and meet directly in one room at one sort of networking reception and meet and greet these government agencies that are attending the event, as well as they'll specifically invite certain primes that match up with the technology areas to have that one-on-one moment right then and there. Next slide. So our team is listed here. These are our main players on our transition team, and I do have their direct contact information here. You are welcome to get in touch with any of them to ask questions about the program, specifically what it can offer. You can also contact anyone on my team here at DARPA, and our email address is sbir@darpa.mil. We do operate slightly differently than the larger services. However, we try to keep things digestible, and we're happy to provide that one-on-one support if you have any questions about the program or about the transition team. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. So now that we have a basic understanding of commercialization readiness and commercialization assistance programs, specifically DARPA and Army, we'd like to take some time to discuss why many companies struggle to commercialize or transition. I'll bring back Jangela to get us started with this piece of the conversation.
You can advance to the next slide. So I would like to take a few minutes to discuss your value proposition and some of the challenges you face as both an innovator and an entrepreneur. Next slide. We aren't able to show this video during the webinar today, but I would encourage each of you to watch it via the provided link. I wanted to share it because this is the same conversation that I've had with hundreds of SBR and STTR awardees, innovators, and entrepreneurs over the last 2 decades. It's also the same type of conversation that my colleagues have had in and out of the SBR and STTR community from a program management perspective. Your main takeaway from viewing this video should be the fact that it's not enough to have an idea and then develop a prototype and expect anyone to invest in or buy your solution simply because you've invested your time and energy into it. I think that's the biggest mistake that I've seen with small businesses and large businesses trying to get their product to market or transition into a program of record. You need to be able to articulate how you're solving a problem and why your solution solves that problem better than anything else. So next slide. Entrepreneurs face challenges, and although you guys are innovators first, part of what it takes to bring your product to market is entrepreneurship. You are businesses. And as a small business, the statistics are not in your favor. And federal research and development funding often delays failure because while performing R&D, your small business is generating enough revenue to stay afloat. But going beyond phase 2 or reaching phase 3 means being ready for your next chapter as a small business beyond the SBR and STTR programs. And part of doing that is understanding these common failure points and getting ahead of them from both the technology and business perspective. Next slide. So on the previous slide, you saw common challenges. You're not in touch with customers. There's no real differentiation in the market, so there's a lack of unique value propositions, a failure to communicate value propositions in clear, concise, and compelling fashions, an inability to nail a profitable business model with proven revenue streams. So to address these common failure points, you need to be able to connect with customers in order to truly understand them, frame the conversation around the problems the customer has rather than the problems you think a current product or service could solve. Be iterative in regards to strategy and planning in order to maintain flexibility and be most responsive to outside change. So a good tool to help you with kind of narrowing these things down is something called the business model canvas, which is a visual chart with elements describing your company or your product's value proposition, infrastructure, customers, and finances. So the business model canvas assists you in aligning your activities from a technology development or business perspective by illustrating the potential trade-offs. But I have to add that doing these things, solving these problems, they're not automatically going to solve the barriers to commercialization that each of you will likely face. But they will help you to address the friction points that keep you and your solution from achieving commercialization. I'd also like to add that sometimes technologies are not ready to transition when needed because there might be too much risk, or it might be too costly, or the solution might be too difficult to adopt at that time. Additionally, at other times, promising technologies aren't taken advantage of because their potential has not been adequately demonstrated or recognized, or they don't meet military user requirements, or users are unable to find the final stages of development and testing. So, with that, sometimes you're just going to be too early and it's going to take time. And this is where knowing your customer and knowing your stakeholder is really important, because those stakeholders can help champion you to find the funding and ultimately make it into a system. A quick reminder that the factors that facilitate successful transition outcomes include selecting the right projects. So with SBIR and STTR, it's going to be selecting the right topics. Those that address military needs, have realistic cost and schedule expectations, and have technologies that can be matured or demonstrated, ensuring early and sustained commitments from intended users and other key stakeholders throughout projects. And the last thing I want to say is I encourage everyone to review the training and other resources available at training.defensebusiness.org. The training and resources there are tremendously insightful and helpful. They address the things that I've gone over in this webinar. And there's also a book that you can get on Amazon. It's called Talking to Humans. So if all you've done is talk about your ideas and how they're going to change the world with your colleagues, it's going to be important to get outside of your bubble in order to further probe your value proposition with folks that have no idea about the technology space that can give you honest feedback. And again, that book is called Talking to Humans. I think you can get it for like 99 cents. It's maybe about a 2-hour read. And every time I recommend that to innovators, they're like, this really changed the way I talk to people in eliciting feedback on my solution. And that's it for me.
Got it. Thanks, Angela. Thanks for our recommendation. So now I'd like to introduce Ray Friesenhan to talk about commercialization and transition best practices. And his work with TechLink, they've been doing a lot of work with the DoD SBIR companies for years. And so really excited to have him as a part of this webinar. Ray?
Thank you very much, Phil. Next slide, please. Just want to reiterate that these commercialization assistance programs are great as long as you take advantage of them, and you should do everything you can to do so. But as entrepreneurs with your businesses, you're in the driver's seat. You're driving the future of your company and your success. So here are just a few lessons that you might take advantage of based on some studies that we have done of commercialization best practices. Next slide. Just as a little background on TechLink, we're the first and primary defense partnership intermediary nationwide. We've been at this for almost 20 years now, helping companies win SBIR awards, helping them commercialize and transition the technologies, and in recent years actually doing some surveys nationwide to find out what these companies have actually done in terms of economic results. In 2014, we conducted the first comprehensive, most intense study up to that date looking at the results of a program for the Air Force. And we followed that with a similar study for the Navy. And both of those studies are very useful. They were used by Congress in SBIR reauthorization, and you can download them either from our website or from sbir.gov. And very recently, we've just completed the largest, most comprehensive SBIR study ever undertaken, looking at the results from 17,000 DoD Phase 2 awards, so over 4,400 companies that started as early as 1995 through FY12. And just to illustrate how comprehensive this was, our team of researchers were able to get responses from 93% of the companies involved, who had about 96% of all records. So this is a really thorough study. Next slide, please. But going back to that 2014 study for the Air Force, one thing that came out of it this year was a best practices study. You know, we had looked at in that study at 1,750 companies, and we categorized the top performers in 7 different categories. And we did in-depth interviews with 104 of them. That's about 6% of the companies in the study. And these results are available to download at our website, and I really recommend that you do so because there's a lot of useful information that I will not be able to cover here. Next slide, please. But just, looking at the top commercialization categories, these top 4 stand well above the rest, and they're mainly basic business best practices that anyone in business should be familiar with. First of all, know the customers. Second, communicate with your customers. The third one is to actually have thought out a well-planned commercialization strategy. And you should be doing this as part of your phase 1 proposal and more in-depth with your phase 2. And partnering and relationships are very, very important as well. But 3 of these 4 really interrelate very, very closely. And I'm going to talk a little more about them. Next slide, please. The first one, know your customer. This just illustrates this from advice from one of the top performers. Not only know your customer, be able to name the person who will buy your product at the time you submit your first phase 1 proposal, basically. And to add a little bit more to that, it would be very helpful to you if that customer can name you, if they know your name, if they could even recognize your face. That's how you build customer relationships. Next slide. Communication. As scientists and engineers, which I was myself, it's so easy to fall into just communicating by email. We can think it out, we know what we're saying, and can review it before we send it. But that's not sufficient. None of the top performers believed email was the best way to go about it. And they very strongly advocated for face-to-face contact when possible. And if you can develop face-to-face contact, get to know the customers, the people you'll be working with, that's important. Do so if you can. Next slide. And relationship building. This is a very broad category, but being at this 20 years, the main thing that stood out to me is certainly that the most successful companies were the ones who were very good at building networks of relationships. I've seen fantastic technologies, breakthrough technologies I thought were wonderful, where the company eventually failed because they could not maintain a good business relationship. Now, for SBIR companies, your program manager or technical point of contact is your first point of contact, but leverage that relationship. Make a relationship with them, but leverage it to get introductions to end users, acquisition programs, prime contractors if you can. Now, this next line, I'm going to get into this a little more because it's very important on my last slide. Do not rely on a single relationship because your program manager, your TPOC, can always be reassigned, be deployed, or retire, or they just may not have all the connections that you need. Now, prime contractors, of course, are hugely important because most military sales, and we are talking about DoD SBIR, are made through prime contractors. If you go to any SBIR conference, you'll find a lot of their representatives hanging around trying to meet you and build relationships with the small businesses. And some of them even put out email lists around each solicitation listing contacts who are interested in specific topics and the companies who can respond to those topics. So look for the right prime contractors and build some relationships with them if you can. And something that most companies don't really know about or don't follow up with is there's about 100 DoD labs out there, and they are available to work with through things like cooperative R&D agreements or CRADAs. The companies we've worked with to help develop these CRADAs were very often much more successful because they built relationships. They got to understand their military customer, and they built their credibility just based on this formal cooperative R&D agreement. So there's groups like the Federal Laboratory Consortium, or FLC, if you look them up, who can help you find not just DoD labs, but any labs that can help you establish some of these formal relationships or find technologies that can help you with your business development. Next slide, please. But most of all, as a business, plan for the long term. as Jangela said too, you need to look ahead. It's going to take a long time here. Ron Schroeder of Frontier Technology said, recommend being very selective on what you propose to. Make sure it fits with what you want the company to become. That is, you need a long horizon on your perspective of the company. I always tell companies, don't just chase money, don't go after a topic just because you see you can do it and you think you can win, because that will take you in many directions you really don't want to go, because the long term is where you're going to be looking at. And I'll get into this in the next slide, please. So here are some lessons learned from this big study that we just completed. Next slide. If you look, this is some preliminary data we got on the economic results from the 17,000 DoD Phase 2 awards. Now, things that stand out is way back long ago, 20 years, there were some huge successes that came about. Some of these companies became big, some of them just based on a single SBIR award, like Broadcom. We had a speaker at Beyond Phase 2 in Orlando a month ago whose technology came from a single DARPA SBIR award, and this was Reza Rafagaran, whose company merged with Broadcom, and he later on went to form his own company after that, but their technology became a significant part of Broadcom's sales. Others like In Situ, which developed some of the first defense UAVs, and others. They had a long time to mature, and there's probably a lot others in there that we just couldn't find the data for because it was obscured or buried in prime contractors. The next thing you might notice is it takes a long time to become very successful. If you see where that upslope is at around 2006, 2007, remember this study was just completed, so realize it can take 10 to 12 years or more to really become successful from the start of a Phase 2. So focus on the long term, as the previous person said, what you want your company to become, because you want to be in this for a decade or more. Now there's one other odd little thing about this chart that relates back to some of the best practices. There's an odd dip you'll see on here starting around 2000 going to 2003, 2004, where you would have expected results to be much bigger. That dip is both follow-on R&D, military sales, commercial sales. Now, why would that dip be there? Was there a change in the program? Was there an event that happened? Well, if you think about it, 911 happened right about then. This was the award start date, so awards that started in 2000 and lasted for 2 years were still ongoing when 911 occurred. And so if we think about it, the working hypothesis is that companies that were performing Phase 2s around this period found that a lot of their program managers or TPOCs who were military officers were getting deployed, and a lot of the civilian program managers were getting reassigned. So the idea I mentioned earlier, don't rely on a single point of contact, on a single program manager. That is probably what happened back then, is that all the deployments and reassignments caused a lot of these companies to lose traction, even though there was so much more funding being invested in military programs at the time. So use that as a guiding principle, is your relationships are important, but don't rely on a single one. Build a lot of them. Leverage the relationships you do have to add more. And if you're not an outgoing person who's good at building relationships, bring someone into your company in terms of business development who can help you do so. And with that, next slide, I'm finished here.
Thanks, Ray. So now I want to open the conversation to questions. We've had a lot of questions come in through the webinar and beforehand, so really excited. As a reminder to participants, we will send a transcript of this webinar via email within 30 business days, as well as post this on the SBIR STTR training and advocacy website. I'd also like to remind everyone that if you have a question, please click on the blue question mark located at the top of the page. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions about the commercialization programs in aggregate. And so, and James, this may be a question for you, sort of a two-piece. One, is there a listing of all the commercialization programs at the DoD? And then the second question is, can you talk to us a little bit about what DTA is as an alternative to a formal commercialization program?
Sure, I can take that. So you can get information on the commercialization readiness programs at the main DoD, SBIR, and STTR website. And I can't list that off the top of my head. It's the ACQ website. But information on those legislatively mandated CRP programs, they're also available at SBA's SBIR website. So that's sbir.gov. And they're also available on the DoD, SBIR, and STTR training and advocacy website, which is training.defensebusiness.org. And at the training.defensebusiness.org site, you'll also find information on the other available transition assistance programs. And so just to reiterate, CRP is at Army, Air Force, and Navy. Navy also has a transition assistance program in addition to their CRP. And the other two agencies within DoD that have transition assistance are the Missile Defense Agency and DARPA. So the other thing that everyone can do is just go to the specific component website, SBIR, STTR website, and everyone that I just mentioned has information on the commercialization readiness programs and or transition assistance programs, depending on whether or not it's a service or an agency. As far as the second part of your question for discretionary technical assistance, discretionary technical assistance is generally available to small businesses that are working with a component that does not offer transition assistance or commercialization readiness programs. There are some where you can do both, but most of them, it's one or the other. So discretionary technical assistance offers up to $5,000 for phase one, and then up to $10,000 for phase two. And phase two, that $10,000 is for the first and second years of the period of performance. In order to qualify for discretionary technical assistance, you must propose for it when you submit your phase one and your phase two proposals. And the components that have that available do have instructions on how to propose for discretionary technical assistance in the SBIR and STTR BAAs and their specific component instructions. What small businesses can do with DTA is they can use it for anything that helps commercialize their solution, and that can be anything. It can be marketing assistance. It can be technical, as in scientific or R&D or S&T type assistance. It can be market research. And so the legislative authority for DTA is purposely vague. SBA is actually working on shoring that up, so that might change within the next several months. But as it stands, it's very vague. You have to propose for it. And the final clincher is just because you propose for it does not mean that you're going to get it. And that's because there's a weird wrinkle in the legislation that authorized DTA in that services and agencies, they can't plan for the DTA they're spending. So even though they can typically plan the number of phase one and phase two awards, they are technically not supposed to plan for DTA awards against that. So in general, across the board, DTA is only available if it's approved and if funding is available. But I would say stay tuned. It looks like changes might be coming down the pike within, I would say, the next 6 to 12 months on how DTA evolves.
Got it. Thanks, Angela. This next question I'll gear toward Glenn. The question is, what does DoD consider ready for commercialization? I.e., are there metrics or qualities of project needs to demonstrate? Glenn, can you talk us through a little bit of that? What qualifies someone to be ready for a phase 2 enhancement or a CRP program?
Well, sure. And I'm going to kind of think the nature of the question is probably geared toward something that's ready to go into a program, and not just the general term of anything other than SBIR. So program managers and the way that the requirements are done typically are looking at technical maturity and read that to be the risk associated with being successful. So I think that the technical maturity, both and the manufacturing readiness are the two things that are often very, very highly looked at, and they are in particular looking for testing and evaluation as a way of showing that what you have is ready to go and it's ready to be inserted into their program. Program managers are typically very, cautious of things that haven't been demonstrated, and just from the nature of what they do for a living, it's hard to convince them to bring something in that hasn't really gone through the reins. I think that's the number one thing. That's it.
Got it. Thanks, Glenn. For Ann, a question for you. You described how DARPA seems to maintain a relationship with some of its companies. And so the question is, if you try to commercialize something and you aren't successful the first time, but you feel another attempt may be more fruitful, can you do another commercialization assistance program, or is there another process for those types of companies in those situations?
Well, you are officially off-boarded at some point after your contract has ended. However, the relationship with our team is still there, and there are certain ways to keep in communication and to, like I said, keep on their alumni list where you're going to get those notifications. But the tailored one-on-one assistance is only going to be associated with that one contract, and then your next contract that you get could sort of renew that timeline.
Got it. Ray, a question for you. On your chart, I noticed that hiring was in the, I'll say, less important side of the chart. But can you talk about what kind of team do companies need to assemble if they want to get ready for commercialization?
The kind of team that you assemble for commercialization really depends on the size of the company. I have seen very small companies that were headed by physicists and engineers who took it upon themselves to go out and push beyond their old style of, sitting in and doing research to, say, for example, take many company executives to lunch and probe them. Basically, hey, we'll buy you lunch and just ask questions on what to do. What were your best practices? How should we make connections here? Can you give us any connections? So your team is going to be dependent on that. But as soon as you're capable, I would highly recommend bringing in someone with some business development and marketing experience. It tends to be a much different personality style than the engineering and scientific backgrounds of people who start a lot of these SBIR companies.
Got it. James, we've got a few questions about commercialization assistance programs and a quote-unquote mentorship program. And so would love to hear you chat a little bit about the difference between commercialization assistance and maybe mentor protege and how companies may want to think about those two.
So I would say the biggest difference between the two programs is the commercialization readiness programs through the services. Those are geared specifically towards SBIR and STTR awardees. I would say by and large awardees that have received a phase 2 contract in order to shepherd those folks through the process of bringing their technology to the warfighter. These readiness programs are inherently focused on the connection of SBIR and STTR funded technology and the end user environment within the Department of Defense. The mentor protege program is essentially where a small business, which is the mentee, is teamed up with a mentor, typically through a prime contractor. And so almost all of the large prime contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, etc., they typically have information on their respective websites on how you can work with them in order to become a mentee. And in these constructs, the mentor, which is typically a large defense prime, helps to shepherd the small business in doing business with the Department of Defense. And so it's typically not restricted to technology, although that takes up, I would say, the largest portion of it. And there are some benefits both to the prime and to the subcontractor. So the prime typically receives funding from DoD in order to perform as a mentee. The mentor. The mentee can actually get past performance in being a mentee or protege of these large primes. And so I would encourage, where possible, SBIR and STTR firms actually be engaged with those mentor protege programs. I have to say, just like anything else, there are good experiences and bad experiences. I've heard more good experiences than bad, especially when the mentor is a very experienced, seasoned mentor. And you can get information on the Mentor Protege program from OSD's Office of Small Business Programs website. So if you just do a quick Google search, OSD, OSBP, MPP, hashtag alphabet soup, that was a joke, but you'll be able to bring up that information and what the requirements are for application. Just a quick warning though, the OSBP site, it's only going to give you information on what the Mentor Protege program is, or MPP. Specific applications to MPP, you can only get through the Prime directory, which should be available on the OSBP site.
Got it. Thank you. Our next question, Glenn, I'll direct it your way. What types of technologies are best suited for commercialization assistance programs? And then is there anything special? We had a couple of questions come in about the medical side. Have you seen anything around that in your experience?
First question, the first half of that one was tough. What type of technology is best suited? And I'll kind of lead into that by saying we see it all. We see people that are developing ideas as essentially the final product, to people that are building things in green boxes with military dials on them. My experience says that the hardest ones that people have in marketing is when you're developing a software application, some type of an API or some improvement or some algorithm which is very specific to one military use. In that case, your marketing is generally limited to whoever that prime contractor is who has the winning proposal. So it's definitely doable. Somebody is definitely going to win, but it's hard to take a specific application or a specific algorithm and go and market it around. The ones I think that the types of things that's easier, it's never very easy in this field, are things that clearly you can put into a box and take to somebody and demonstrate and say, if you buy this, we will make your life easier. The question about medical, could you just kind of run back that question again?
Yeah, just any insight into what the medical commercialization process may look like, any differences between that process and a non-medical, given some of the testing, FDA, human testing implications.
Yeah, of course, the biggest difference with the medical one is you have this dual track toward getting certified. You have to go down the DoD acquisition life cycle, and you also have to go down through the Food and Drug Administration or FDA approval loop as well. Going through either one is hard. Going through both at the same time is excruciating. And we do, and of course, I have the military health programs, including ones that are out of the Defense Health Agency as well, in my suite. They take longer. The life cycle, you can rarely go out of sort of what you think of as a prototype or concept development. You're still looking at years and years and years of getting authorized and going through the approval loop. But that's not unique to the military field. That's more related to how hard it is to commercialize medical products.
Got it. That makes sense. And a question for you. How much of a commitment does a company have to have from a commercialization partner, whether that's a private sector or in the DoD space? How deep does that commitment have to be? What does it typically look like? Any insight you can give would be great.
Do you mean specifically who they would transition their technology to? How much of a commitment does that, like Prime, for example, will have to give?
Correct.
Well, it really is going to depend widely on the technology and what exactly that Prime is looking to get. It could be something as simple as purchasing a product or the rights to something after the fact, after it's been developed, and it's really just a transaction, or it could be becoming a teaming partner with them for the long run, being a subcontractor to a number of future proposals and efforts that they do for years to come. They could also eventually be acquired by the business. There are lots of different levels of involvement that relationship can result in.
Got it. Ray, we had a really interesting question come in regarding your last slide. And so it looks like, per the slide, that the private commercialization was a big part of revenue in the past, but it's starting to dip. And so the question was, is it becoming more difficult to enter private commercialization market? And then any comments that you guys have observed or thought about from the research?
Well, this is Ray, and thanks for the question. I would not draw those kind of conclusions from that data. The one area around 9/11 where we saw the big dip, that may be just because the companies were not able to make good connections and they were refocused into other areas or something of that nature. But there were some huge successes that kind of skewed the data from way back when. So any individual award, if you incubate it for 20 years, could have that kind of success. And there's some that are very likely to be that successful. It just takes a long time to get those kind of huge results. They accelerate. It's exponential growth on some of these commercialization results, whereas military sales usually don't have that kind of potential for exponential growth. It's more linear. So I don't think there's anything that really different in the commercial markets. You just have to decide what your commercial markets are and how you're going to address them, and use SBIR to help you get there.
Got it. This question I think would be good for probably Glenn. We have a company here. They said that they've done TAP and CAP, and they're still having trouble getting into a program of record. And so I guess the question really is, after someone goes through your program, and if they're not successful moving forward into a program of record, what kind of next steps should they take as they continue moving along?
So I guess let's assume that they have something that works, and that there is that there really is an addressable market, and they just haven't been able to crack into it. I would say you need to understand where, all of the marketing aspects of it. You need to understand what the timelines are, when the RFPs are coming out, who the primes are. Now, that's not mind-blowing information I'm telling you all right now, but it is, because it's just doing your market research. But I would say, unless you're producing the product that you intend to sell to the Army, I would concentrate on going after primes. And working that angle, because they're ultimately the ones that are going to determine whether or not you're successful in selling into this DoD market.
Got it. Thanks for that. And so, Ann, I would put this next question to you. I think it's complementary. And so the question was, what is the most successful method for leveraging transition organizations to drive demos in front of DoD users? And so I know you guys do that through your own program. Are there things that companies can learn, best practices, or is the answer also, to Glenn's point, to work with the primes?
Yeah, again, work with the primes. That's really going to be a good way to get there. But there are also a lot of DARPA technology is so early that a lot of times our transition success is done by transitioning into another DARPA program that's ongoing, or to another DoD program, because even when it's finished as a success in our program, it may not be anywhere near final completion and ready for deployment. So in addition, with working with the primes, you want to keep those conversations going with the DARPA program manager that is managing your specific effort. They are going to be a lot of help, probably almost as much help as the transition and commercialization support team is going to be for that.
Got it. Thank you. Ray, we've got a lot of questions about statistics, and I'm wondering if you may have some insight from all of your research. Can you give us a sense of the percentage of phase ones that go to phase two, and really what people are curious on is the percentage of phase two that go to phase three. Have you guys done any digging into that on your side that you can share with us?
Well, as far as phase three, no one keeps really good statistics on that, because phase three is not always a formal designation. And Navy's been tracking those pretty well, and other services and components of DoD have been doing a lot more in terms of formal phase three. But we found so many things that were generally phase three, but just not officially designated at that. But, what we found is that more than half of the companies who had completed their phase two did get follow-on revenue. And there were smaller numbers, who had larger commercialization results. Like, maybe 30% of them had follow-on revenue of more than $1 million, and 11-12% had revenue of more than $5 million. The big successes are much more rare than that, but it's still, better than your odds of trying to secure venture capital, which is something like 1% chance of getting VC. So your chances of having real commercial follow-on, real success after a phase two is much higher than that.
This is Jangela with Cali Group. I just wanted to chime in really quickly. Historically, the conversion rate of phase one to phase two is about 40%. And one of the reasons why statistics on phase two to phase three conversion is so difficult to come by is because a lot of businesses aren't reporting back. So they graduate out of SBR and STTR, and unless there is follow-up, like the type of follow-up that Ray's done and TechNet has done through the DoD study, as well as the Air Force and Navy studies, unless that type of follow-up is happening, DoD there is no carrot or stick
for us to get all of that data. And so that is one of the biggest impediments to really getting good statistics on that specific type of conversion.
Got it. And Janja, I was actually coming to you for the next question. Can you talk a little bit about reachbacks for phase twos and what that looks like?
Sure. So reachback or reachback strategies are when any federal agency, not just DoD, kind of looks at the catalog of prior SBIR and STTR phase ones and phase twos. Because the competition requirement has already been satisfied, any federal agency can reach back and create a new award. And that can be another SBR STTR award, or it could technically be a phase 3 award. It just depends on the construct. And I would say that different components within DoD are better at it or leverage that more than others, and the same goes on the federal space. I would say that with the 2012 reauthorization, there was language that really impeded federal agencies from having a reachback strategy. So in the 2012 reauthorization, prior to the 2012 reauthorization, that you could reach back an unlimited amount of times. So as someone that performed on a phase 2 could have 10 more phase 2s on work that was related to what they did on that initial phase 2. With the 2012 reauthorization, there was language added that the maximum number of awards for a particular type of solution against a given topic was 2 phase 2s. And so what that meant was any award made with FY13 funds and beyond. So for topics, we're talking about topics that appeared in the 2013 BAAs are really not available for reachback, especially for those services like Navy that has the phase 2B. That phase 2B basically creates that second phase 2 award. And so with the 2017 reauthorization, there's been no change. And so while reachback is still effective for those companies that are getting the maximum of 2 phase 2s through the original component that awarded their phase 2, they are pretty much not eligible for that anymore unless it's non-SBR STTR funding for a phase 3. And I realize everything that I just said might be super confusing. So if anyone has additional questions on that, just feel free to send it to the organizers of the workshop. And I'm happy to get in touch with you to explain that more.
Perfect. So I want to conclude with what I hope will be helpful for folks. And I'd love to conclude with a success story from each of you. And so if we could just put together a small success story and then sort of the key being what made it successful, I think that would be helpful for the audience. And so, Anne, if you don't mind, we'd like to start with you from DARPA, a success story and sort of what made it successful.
Yeah, we have quite a few, actually. It's hard to pinpoint one specific company, but we have a number of our organizations that have been working on DARPA technology and have found that connection with the commercial world as opposed to DoD, which a lot of times our focus for our transition team is to steer them towards DoD. But we have a lot of successes in the commercial world as well that have gone on to make those connections with primes, as well as some unconventional primes for the DoD world, places like Google and Microsoft, and places that aren't the first thing you would think of when you think of a DoD contractor. And our team has helped make those connections with that side of the commercialization world and really taken these small businesses on as a main supplier, or in a number of cases brought them in directly and even acquired the company and brought in the entire team as employees.
Great. Ray, I'll turn to you. Any success stories you'd like to share and sort of what made them successful?
Yeah, there's quite a few success stories. In fact, that was one of our mandates, is to uncover hundreds of success stories from this study. And if you go to our website, if you download that best practices, there's a number of success stories in the best practices book. And you'll also see a link to success story videos, where we have about 30 videos with a lot more in production yet for SBIR successes. But just one quick one. There's a company in Huntsville, Alabama called Gator, G-A-T-R, and they developed an inflatable satellite communications or SATCOM antenna. And one of the key things with them is when they had their prototype ready, an event happened. It was Hurricane Katrina. And they saw a need, an opportunity, where they were able to drive for several hours to go and deploy one of these to help some of the folks impacted by Katrina communicate, say, with spouses in Iraq or with others through the satellite communications. And that one event was kind of a keystone for their future success. So it's important for any entrepreneur developing SBIR technologies to watch for anything where they can deploy their technology, demonstrate it in a key aspect, and just show the usefulness of what they're doing. Because Gator was bought a couple of years ago by Cubic Corporation, and it's public record that they were sold for $232.5 million. So that is one thing we found with a lot of these small businesses who were bought when they were successful, is they were very often sold for several $100 million. So keep that in mind if you can really make your SBIR into this kind of a success story.
Got it. Glenn, if you have a very brief story to share, that would be great, and then we can conclude.
Well, sure. Ray stole mine. I would encourage everybody to go and look at Gator, G-A-T-R, and to see what they did. And I'll just add, that was an example of how they did that. Is they crossed over programs. It's now being fielded by the Army, but they developed that technology under somebody else's SBIR auspices, and they were very persistent, very successful in doing what they did. It's a good story.
Got it. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to participate today. As you know, this workshop is part of an ongoing series that we're hosting for the SBIR STTR program. Our next workshops will be October 9th, where we'll cover test and evaluation, and October 30th, where we'll talk about the Phase 3 process and how to identify non-SBIR funding. To register for upcoming workshops, please follow the URL provided on the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. So previous workshop slides, audio, recordings, and transcripts can all be found at training.defensebusiness.org/recordings. Please complete the post-workshop survey. We'd appreciate your feedback by completing it. A link will be displayed at the end of the session where you can complete it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us at sbirtraining@bitecube.com. Thank you again for your attendance, and we encourage you to join us for additional workshops. We really appreciate it. Have a good day.